Well, the roller coaster ride continues. Following Friday's Oval Office meltdown, which featured Zelensky leave Washington without signing a minerals deal, and not even eating lunch, Monday saw a halt to U.S. aid to Ukraine. Then we had Tuesday's not technically a State of the Union address, but still basically a State of the Union address, where Trump mentioned receipt of a letter from Zelensky that effectively smoothed over Friday's botched summit. And thus, we now sit and wait to find out whether that means the United States will restore aid as the world transitions to a phase of negotiations with Russia. But you guys do not sit and wait to give me questions, so let's get to them. How much of the military aid can Trump stop without Congress? Didn't they pass a bill under Biden that would have to be revoked? Well, now we're looking at some of the subtleties about how laws are passed and then what actually happens in practice. It is true that Congress allocates funds through laws, which generally have a president's signature, and as the question is suggesting, was also the case that it was Biden's signature. And then the thing is that after that, the president is supposed to faithfully execute the laws that are laid out by Congress. And what we're observing right now with the Trump administration, and this is not just a military aid to Ukraine thing, we'll get back to that in a second, the president is choosing not to just spend those funds, even though those funds have been allocated and by law they are supposed to be spent. This is a process known as impoundment, and impoundment actually does make sense to a certain degree. For example, if Congress passed a bill that appropriated, say, $15 billion to the development of an aircraft carrier, and then the president, after many years of development, came back and said, actually, we got some very competitive contracts, and we found some ways to save a little bit of money. I only spent $13 billion on this aircraft carrier. I am not going to spend an extra $2 billion giving it fancy decorations. So impoundment like that has always been a thing, and it's something that Congress and the executive branch generally agree to be a good thing. Where this ran into problems was during the Nixon administration, where Richard Nixon really started just impounding money in a way similar to what we're seeing right now with the Trump administration. And that's where Congress came back to pass laws that force the president to spend the money, and not just impound money for the sake of impounding money, basically because the president does not agree with the way that money is being spent. Well, the way that the Trump administration has been thinking about this is that they're just not going to spend the money, and they're going to wait to see what the Supreme Court has to say about it, because obviously there are a bunch of individuals within the United States that have a vested interest in that money being spent, and are thus challenging these sorts of decisions by the Trump administration through the legal system. Actually, we just got the first taste of that today. In a 5-4 ruling, the Supreme Court declared that the United States government has to spend USAID money, which is obviously something that the Trump administration was really not wanting to do. Now, the Supreme Court pushed it back to lower courts to try to figure out what to do about all of the money that was supposed to be spent over the last month or so. It's hard to keep track of time these days. So we don't exactly know what this is going to look like. There's still a question mark there. And there's a second question mark about what the Trump administration is going to do. Because it's one thing for the Supreme Court to tell the executive that the executive has to do something, but the Supreme Court doesn't have the ability to enforce the laws that it comes up with, or the way that it declares rulings on particular laws. And so it is going to be an interesting question what happens, and this is also just an interesting constitutional question, about what happens if the Trump administration tries to resist that. Well, basically the same sort of stuff applies to military aid to Ukraine. There is going to be legal challenges going through the court system about that, and we will eventually see perhaps the Supreme Court issue a ruling on it. I am not a lawyer, but my outside perspective on this is that the cases between USAID and Ukraine aid look relatively similar, and so my anticipation would be that we would see, again, a similar sort of ruling from the Supreme Court. That all assumes that there is not some sort of resolution between Ukraine and the United States in the meantime, which would render the entire conversation irrelevant. Nevertheless, this does raise a practical problem. If you go in an extended period of time not providing aid and letting this filter through the courts, that has a tangible effect of what's going on the ground. And as a consequence, it might matter less about what the court system actually rules on this, but the sheer fact that you can delay it that long still gives the president a lot of coercive leverage over Ukraine. At what point do you think the rest of the world will be done and start boycotting the US economy and calling all of Trump's bluffs? Well, here's the thing. One does not simply ignore the United States. The United States is just so much larger economically and militarily than every other country that every other country is indeed forced to look to the United States as an agenda setter and move according to how the United States, or at least respond to according to how the United States acts. One of my favorite factoids about that is what happens when there's an economic crisis in the United States. You would think that if the crisis were in the United States, that this would cause problems for the US dollar. But it turns out that because the world economy is so based around what goes on in the United States and the US dollar, and that the underlying strength, even if there is a short-run crisis in the United States, the underlying strength of the US economy is so large as compared to other countries, that oftentimes you will see other countries' currencies do even worse, even though it is the United States that's causing the economic problem. That being said, we have started seeing a whole bunch of ad hoc meetings in Europe regarding what is going on with the United States. So there is some motion in that direction, but in terms of alternative institutional development, they already have what they need. They have the European Union for that purpose, and that's not going to change. We'll see what happens with NATO. Obviously, I've spent a lot of time recently talking about what goes on inside of the NATO organization, what NATO's feelings are about this as of a few weeks ago, as well as the underlying founding principles of NATO to try to keep the United States ingrained in European security affairs. So there will certainly be lots of discussion as it relates to, say, military procurement, which I think will be the subject of another question, or maybe more than one question coming up. But it doesn't change the fact that the United States is just so large that Europe is going to have to figure out a way to make this work, even as the Trump administration is becoming difficult to work with. Since Keith Kellogg's peace plan intended to use the reduction of aid, or the threat thereof, to pressure Ukraine into following the plan, how does this premature aid pause affect that strategy? Especially now that Ukraine and Europe have more time to adjust and increase their own efforts, the US may have less leverage over Ukraine, which could reduce the incentive for Ukraine to follow the Kellogg plan. So basically, has Trump played his Trump card too early? Geez, so much conversation about cards lately, you'd think that we were playing Balatro. It is very clear that the threat to cut aid to Ukraine is credible as a consequence of what we are seeing now. However, that was never really the problem. The real problem flowed the other way, and still flows the other way, with the credibility of oversupplying Ukraine if Russia were to hold up the peace plan. So, generally speaking, I don't think this influences beliefs all that much. And as for the latter part of this question, or at least the concern that the reader is giving, I think there's a marginal effect on timing here, but it's probably not worth overstating the consequence of it. If the United States had waited to the point that there was a real peace process in the mix, and not just the concepts of a peace plan, but actually people sitting down at a table negotiating what a ceasefire might look like, and then trying to implement that ceasefire. If at that point Ukraine had refused to participate, and the United States then cut US aid to Ukraine, Europe was going to respond one way or another. As far as I can tell right now, though, Europe is not using this extra lead time to get the physical processes of armament moving. Instead, what's going on is the conversations where they're coordinating the actions rather than taking the actions. And so it seems that they are largely still in the process of waiting and seeing what will happen, with the caveat that, generally speaking, even before the Trump administration came into office, going back to 2022, there has been an increase in military spending in Europe more broadly, and that sort of thing is having an effect currently and will continue to have an effect. But in terms of what's going on in the shock from the last week or two, it doesn't seem like this is kickstarting the process of the physical components of it. We're just starting to see the planning stages happen a little bit more rapidly. That does save some time later, of course. It is just that if this were an emergency, that coordination and planning process would be occurring much more quickly, and we wouldn't see it as drawn out. So the fact that this is happening early is allowing Europe to draw out the process, rather than truly hastening it in an effective way. Since no one yet knows when, if ever, US military aid to Ukraine will resume, and it is out of the picture for the foreseeable future, I'm going to guess that the reader here had not seen the State of the Union, or the fake State of the Union, when this question was asked. What are some of the most immediate potential effects it will have on the ground in Ukraine? Well, it's a mixed bag. Earlier this morning, there are reports that the United States is also cutting intel sharing with Ukraine, and the effects of that sort of thing could be immediate. For example, if the United States is not telling Ukraine that there are a bunch of Russian soldiers heading in that direction, and Ukraine needs to start rallying the defenses to support that particular part of the flank, then yeah, that's going to cause a problem immediately if Ukraine is unable to monitor that sort of thing on its own. The upshot for Ukraine is that in the east, where the fighting is currently the most intense, the bulk of the equipment used in that fighting are drones. And Ukraine is the one that specializes in drone production. It's not the United States and it's not parts of Europe. Ukraine has gone crazy in trying to figure out how to mass produce drones to great effect in this war. And so, fortunately for Ukraine, that type of thing is not going to be directly impacted by the US cutting of aid. And perhaps maybe that is why Ukraine has been a little bit more confident in the way it has pushed back against the Trump administration. Because perhaps the way that Ukraine thinks about this is that if the bulk of the fighting is through drones, and Ukraine has itself insulated from US aid restriction because it can produce its own drones, then Ukraine can stand up for itself a little bit more in the bilateral negotiations between Kyiv and Washington. Nevertheless, this is a bad thing for Ukraine, although the way that we'll see the loss of materiel impact the battlefield will take a longer period of time. The reason being is that it's not just a revolving door where aid comes in and then aid is immediately destroyed on the battlefield. There are some supplies, some stores that Ukraine has of all of this stuff. And so now that Ukraine is under the impression that the aid may be cut off soon, Ukraine is going to be drawing down its current supplies at a slower rate. So instead of using 1,000 of something in a particular day, maybe they go down to about 500. As a consequence, instead of this just being a massive shock to the system and Russia taking a whole bunch of land all at once right now, this will be more of a slow burn. And what we have as the endgame consequence will, of course, depend on what goes on with Europe. If a ceasefire came into effect today, but hostilities resumed in a year, would this benefit Russia or Ukraine compared to continued war? Well, that's a good question, and I think that the answer is unclear overall. Now, I can say that it would be clearly beneficial to Ukraine as it relates to fortifications. Remember, on the Eastern Front, Russia is the one with the initiative. Russia is slowly taking territory, which means that Ukraine is having to figure out how to stop Russia from taking that territory. And as long as Russia keeps moving, it's hard to fortify one particular area to make it more difficult for Russia to keep moving in that way. Over in Kursk, it's more of a mixed bag, but the size of the front in Kursk is much smaller as compared to what the size of the front looks like in the east. And if you do call a timeout for a year, I can tell you that it's going to be much more difficult for Russia to be able to penetrate the next series of front lines that Ukraine builds in the meantime. Even if Europe is not involved in this, even if the United States is not involved in this, if it's just Ukraine literally building trenches and digging for a year, Ukraine will be in a much better position to defend that territory than what is currently the case right now. Why it is unclear overall, though, is that there's still a question mark about what's going to happen in terms of armament productions over the course of that year. Because if Russia continues to produce arms at the rate that it currently is, well, that means that Russia will have a large supply, and as a result, it might be okay to penetrate all of those defenses that Ukraine has built if at the same time Europe is not going to be supporting Ukraine and the United States is not going to be supporting Ukraine with that same level of continued armament. I think that the likelihood of Russia continuing its armament is higher than what goes on with Europe, because if you think about what I've talked about in the past on the main channel as it relates to the economic situation in Russia, the average Russian is doing fairly well as a consequence of the war because of how high wages are being driven up, because of the extra demand for frontline soldiers who are being paid a risk premium, and all of the people in factories that are having to be offered wages that compete with the Ministry of Defense wages. Well, if the Kremlin completely cuts military production after the war ends, then that's going to result in wages just completely falling off a cliff for a gigantic portion of the Russian population, and that is the type of situation that might get individuals to march on the streets of Moscow. The flip side is that it will be more difficult for the Kremlin to convince individuals in Russia to go back to the front lines after a year-long pause and maybe some drawdown from the front line. And in contrast, because you're still in Ukraine, it will be easier to get Ukrainians to go back to the front line if Russia tries to restart the war and push further. But that is a lot of moving parts, and that is why I think that the answer to this question overall is unclear. What timeline should we expect if European NATO members were to prioritize non-US weapons and system manufacturing in a bid to significantly decrease reliance on the US arms industry? You're looking at years. If Europe wants to do this, then Europe is going to do it right. And you can't rush that sort of thing. You can't just blow through the design. You can't just rapidly construct manufacturing buildings. You can't create those fabrication machines overnight either. Because if you do that, you're not going to do it well, those things are going to break, and it's going to cost a lot more in the long run. In the meantime, there is not much concern that the United States and the Trump administration is going to refuse money if Europe says to the United States, hey, we would like to buy these sorts of weapon systems, could we pay you for it? Trump is going to say, yes, I love money, please send more money our way, thank you very much. So as long as that bridge exists, there is no need to rush into this, which is why the timeline that we're looking at is probably on the order of a few years before we really start seeing European manufacturing being able to bear a larger bulk of what goes on in European defense. What are the odds of the Oval Office meltdown being a nothing burger and changing nothing of substance in the war? I would not say it's nothing. The impact might not ultimately be massive depending upon what happens in the next few days, and if what Trump said during the non-State of the Union address, if that is going to be followed through on, and there is going to be some sort of reconvening between Trump and Zelensky where we do see some sort of agreement signed. That remains possible, although, as I've likened to this before, it's like we're in a roller coaster ride with all of the lights off. I don't know where the next turn is, I don't know if we're going up or down, no one really knows at this point. But regardless of what happens there's still two tangible effects worth noting. First is on the Russian side. This is having a tangible effect on the way that Russians are thinking about the war, because they saw this happen, they're continuing to see this happen, and there's lots of discussion about it on television. And that is really bad optics, especially given that it followed up with a lack of an agreement between the United States and Ukraine. I think it would have been passable if there had been that argument in public and not particularly all that impactful. But on Russian television, if you can say simultaneously, look at what's going on inside of the White House right now, you see it here, and also there is no agreement between the United States and Ukraine, that's a powerful message that is going to change minds and change beliefs inside of Russia. The point is that you cannot really put the genie back in the bottle there, and so both the United States and Ukraine, as well as Europe more broadly, are going to be feeling the consequences of that. There was also a tangible effect on Ukrainian morale after this happened, and understandably so. I think, at least with that part, it's easier to go back on it, because if you do get a deal done and there's some sort of handshake and hug inside of the Oval Office and everyone is happy afterward, then that sort of thing is easier to massage within the realm of Ukrainian public opinion. Do you agree what Trump said, that the supposed mineral deal signing would have already implied that the US provides security guarantees, and it was foolish for Zelensky to ask for explicit confirmation? Well, it seems like in every one of these Q&A videos I have to go on some kind of rant. This is the question for it here. I think the discussion about this, not talking about the specific question from the reader, but the discussion in the media and online, I think it's going about this all wrong. I also think that Ukraine is spending way too much time caring about this, and it seems to be the one thing that the Trump administration is dead right about. And to be clear here, I am not talking about the need for some sort of security guarantee to be credibly in effect for there to be a long-lasting and durable peace inside of Ukraine. Rather, I am talking about all of the discussion about having the words security guarantee literally written inside of some document somewhere, which is then formally signed by the parties. Just think about this for a moment. Imagine that there is some sort of document that Trump signs that says, I guarantee the peace inside of Ukraine. Do you think Trump is going to follow through on that sort of commitment when push comes to shove 2 years from now, and Trump decides that it's not really in his best interest or in the United States' interest or whoever's interest that he's caring about at that particular moment Do you think he's actually going to follow through because he said, I guarantee it, in a document from a couple of years ago? Do you think that? If your answer to that question is no, then going through all of the effort and frustration to get it formally written into a document ultimately has little tangible effect on what happens in the world. I also find it all the stranger that Ukraine is the one that's so hung up on this, given that Ukraine has firsthand experience with what went on with the Budapest Memorandum and the lack of follow-through there. And I also get that there's a difference in the language here, that in the Budapest Memorandum it says that there are security assurances, and here we're talking about security guarantees. But again, ask yourself for a moment, do you think the Trump administration is going to get hung up on the word assurance versus guarantee? Oh, it says, I guaranteed it. I really need to intervene now, as compared to it says, oh, I assured that it was going to happen. Maybe I'm not going to now. That may be the type of thing that really excites the international lawyers in the room, but as you know, if you're listening to this channel, international law is not worth the paper that it's written on. And so I would not be banking on Trump again having any sort of difference in opinion if he writes I guarantee it versus I assure it versus having nothing there. And I wouldn't also count on anything changing between Trump and the next administration on that front either. That, of course, does not mean that international laws are never followed. It is just that if you want actors to follow what they write down on a piece of paper, you need to design the incentive structure in a way that makes them want to follow through, and not simply because of what is written down on that page. The Trump administration gets this, and that is why the Trump administration has been saying in regard to a mineral deal, hey, Ukraine, if you want us to follow through on commitments that we make to you, you need to give us a vested stake in the relationship so that we want to follow through when push comes to shove. The Trump administration is very transactional in nature. They're not afraid of telling you that. They will be happy to guide you through that if you're confused. And you can say whatever you want about that, but at least insofar as understanding what they're going to do, it does make life a little bit simpler. If you just figure out a way to convince them that it is in their own best interest to do whatever it is you want them to do, you convince them that it is an America First policy, they're going to do that. And I will let you be the judge of the morality of it, but that's the world that we live in, and that is the world that Ukraine should be trying to operate in as it relates to the Trump administration. Does the rising stock of European defense companies mean anything? Yes, absolutely. There's a whole bunch of media bluster about what is going on with Europe and the United States and Ukraine. But having people talk about it in the media doesn't really tell us too much about what they actually think about the situation. The reason being is that media bluster gets views, and what allows media to succeed is viewership. If you actually want a metric about whether people think or they don't think that something is going to happen, you have to look at some sort of market where there are economic consequences that benefit and reward those who are right and punish those who are wrong. Well, the stock market is one such institution. And so if we are seeing the stocks of European defense companies rising, it means that people who have actual skin in the game think that there are going to be lots of extra orders coming into those European defense companies. And so it's not media bluster that's driving this. It's not also politicians trying to look like they're doing something, even if they're not actually doing something, and that they are worried that if their individual countries make greater military commitments, that there's going to be political blowback, and so they're not actually going to do it, but they're just going to talk about it. What we're seeing in the stock market, because defense companies are having their stocks go up inside of Europe, it means that people actually think that there's going to be more expenditures going through those companies. What are the allies in the Pacific feeling about our treatment of Ukraine? They're not feeling great. Interesting here, and I'm going to focus on Taiwan with the answer to this question, otherwise we would be talking about this for too long. Taiwan supports more aid to Ukraine, which might strike you as being a little bit strange because you might think that this is some sort of zero-sum game, where if the United States is spending more on Ukraine aid, then that might be denying more money to Taiwan and more aid to Taiwan instead. However, Taiwan sees this more as a long-term plan, where if the United States is more serious about what's going on in Ukraine, that's going to result in more armament production, generally speaking, inside of the United States. And when you have those factories set up, it becomes easier to mass produce more assistance to Taiwan after the fact. What is funny about this, in terms of the big US pivot to the Indo-Pacific region, is that the United States does not see this in the same way, or at least the Trump administration does not see this in the same way. The reason being is that if we ever get to the point that the armaments that are being made in Ukraine become useful for Taiwan, that means that China has already landed on the island, and there is a knockout battle between the two of them, between Taiwan and the People's Republic of China, for control over the island. Well, if you're at that point, again, think about this from the America First perspective. The value of Taiwan in the US economy is completely shot. TSMC, other sorts of tech companies, everything that's in the supply chains, all of those companies are going to be, at that point, no longer functioning, which means that the benefit of the United States defending Taiwan is no longer there. Taiwan, of course, would still want to defend Taiwan, but from the perspective of the Trump administration, the battle is lost. It's a Pyrrhic victory at best if Taiwan emerges victorious. Instead, the way that the Trump administration thinks about this is in terms of a naval battle. And if you're fighting with your Navy, well, that has very little effect on what's going on in Ukraine. The US Navy is not involved in that. This is an Army affair. So if we're spending lots of money inside of the United States to try to increase the strength of the US Army, that type of thing is going to take away money from the US Navy, which then takes away from the US ability to intervene to stop China from landing on Taiwan. So if this pivot ultimately does happen at the expense of Ukraine, countries like Taiwan are going to think about this as a second best outcome. They would most like it if there were to be large-scale ramping up of production inside of the United States that then creates that surplus of material for them later on, in addition to the United States also ramping up whatever's going on with the US Navy. But that's not what appears to be happening right here. And so, as a result, this would be a second best, at best, from their perspective. Does the lines on maps theory also apply to trade wars? If so, I feel like it is a more abstract way to think about it, since there is no real area of land gained or lost. Yeah, absolutely. Crisis bargaining is an inefficiency puzzle, just like lost trade is. Rather, instead of dealing with territory, you're dealing with quantities of dollars. But in some ways, that's easier to think about because you're not having to make that awkward transition between how you value pieces of territory and the life of humanity. You're thinking about dollars versus dollars. If we're thinking about this from an efficiency perspective and how much value is being created in the world, mutual tariffs are going to be worse for both parties than free trade. There's going to be more stuff produced under free trade than there would be under mutual tariffs. That's because you can get specialization of labor and focus on the comparative advantages of each country so that they're producing the things that they can make more easily, which allows more stuff to be produced overall. Thus, looking at the situation at the country level, both countries would be better off if they agreed to some sort of trade deal than having high tariffs on both ends. And in turn, if you want to explain why there is some sort of bargaining breakdown, it can't just be because, well, it's happy and everyone likes it that way. There has to be some sort of bargaining friction that prevents the parties from reaching that type of deal. One thing that is particularly worth highlighting in the trade sphere, and this does connect to some degree with crisis bargaining, you think about the personal benefits that leaders might have for fighting a war. The analog to that in a world of tariffs versus free trade is what happens with the domestic constituencies inside of a particular country and who actually wins and loses when there's a trade deal versus when there are tariffs. It turns out that even when there are trade deals allowing more stuff to be produced and consumed, both overall along the entire globe, as well as inside of each individual country, there are groups of people inside of each country that are going to win and lose. The winners are going to win by more than what the losers are going to lose by, but the distributional consequences have political problems that come along with them. The biggest group of winners are going to be the consumers, because there's more stuff being produced and everything is cheaper, they're able to consume more for a lower price, they're very happy. And because every single individual inside of a country is a consumer, that's a lot of people who are going to be winning. Problem there is that they are each individually winning by a relatively small amount. But when you have 300 million something people inside of the United States, even if it's only $1,000 or so per individual, that ends up being a lot of wealth that is created as a consequence. On the flip side, the main loser inside of any given country are going to be companies that produce goods that they actually are not that great at making as compared to what their international competition can do. The reason being is that when you have tariffs, the international competition is not going to be all that competitive domestically, allowing your business to survive, in a manner that would just not be possible if there were free trade. Now, the way that this gets complicated politically is that those individuals inside of the protected industry have their entire livelihood based on the tariffs. If the tariff goes away, they're going to be exposed to the competition from the international market, and they are going to go out of business. That's bad if you're a business owner, but it's also bad if you're a worker in one of those industries because you are going to lose your job. As a result of those losses being so concentrated in that group, if you have a change in policy that impacts that group, those individuals are going to be much more likely to lobby against those changes. And if it comes to actually having those changes on the verge of being implemented, they are going to base their vote perhaps entirely on the policy of a candidate, whether they are supportive or not supportive of the protective tariff. And that's why industries like steel in the United States seems to have a disproportionate political impact. They are concentrated in places that are important politically, like, say, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And so if you have a block of voters that are going to vote based off of what's happening with policies in that way, those candidates are going to be more likely to buckle to the demands of those special interests. That is not the only reason why trade deals may fail. You can still have problems with incomplete information and uncertainty about what the other side is willing to negotiate with you on, and also commitment problems with upholding a particular deal over a longer period of time. But it's just another wrinkle that is added into the realm of tariffs and free trade that is not nearly as present in crisis bargaining. Unrelated to current events, you've mentioned before your interests beyond this are sports. What sports and which teams? Sure, Pittsburgh Steelers, Pittsburgh Penguins, Los Angeles Angels, Los Angeles Lakers, AFC Richmond, Chennai Super Kings, Daniel Cormier back when he was still competing, and Roman Reigns. Can NATO members vote to impose NATO or UN peacekeepers along the future demilitarized zone in Ukraine? Would that possibly trigger Article 5? What happens if some NATO members refuse to comply with Article 5? Well, 3 different questions and 3 separate answers. To begin, NATO members have independent choice here. There's not some sort of vote that is going to force individual countries inside of NATO to do particular actions if they do not want to. There'll be a lot of discussion behind the scenes about that sort of thing, and so maybe there's going to be some leverage and offers and benefits proposed if countries do follow through with particular actions. But there's not going to be something that's going to compel a bunch of NATO countries into peacekeeping operations that they are not interested in doing themselves. Second, Article 5 only applies to attacks on member soil. So if NATO member countries send troops inside of Ukraine as some sort of peacekeepers that are manning the front lines following a ceasefire, and if they were to be attacked then by Russia, that does not actually trigger Article 5 because the armed attack is not occurring on a member country's territory. It would be occurring on Ukrainian territory, and as we all know, there is basically no chance that Ukraine is going to be joining NATO in the short run. For some extra clarity, because this does get a bit confusing, you actually have to go to Article 6 to learn about what is covered under Article 5. Here's what it says. For the purpose of Article 5, an armed attack on one or more of the parties is deemed to include an armed attack, then it gives 2 bullet points. The first bullet point, on the territory of any of the parties in Europe or North America, on the Algerian departments of France, which is no longer relevant, on the territory of Turkey, or on the islands under jurisdiction of any of the parties in the North Atlantic area north of the Tropic of Cancer. And then the second bullet point says, and I apologize because this is a run-on sentence, on the forces, vessels, or aircraft of any of the parties, when in or over these territories, or any other area in Europe in which occupation forces of any of the parties were stationed on the date when the treaty entered into force, or the Mediterranean Sea, or the North Atlantic area north of the Tropic of Cancer. Whew. Now, you may have noticed a legal technicality there. Article 6 says what Article 5 includes. It does not say that everything listed in Article 6 is exhaustive. Nevertheless, that is not how the Allies are thinking about this. The Allies are thinking about what Article 5 covers as being their own territory, not their soldiers stationed elsewhere. That being said, there is an interesting question about what would happen if, in conjunction with an increased attack inside of Ukraine, Russia also starts striking NATO supply lines inside of the NATO countries that are supporting Ukraine. And that could be anything from hitting factories all the way in France, or literally just trying to bomb the freeways and highways that lead from Poland or Romania into Ukraine. That is the type of thing that would lead to conversations about Article 5 being invoked. As for following through on it, getting to the third question here, it's basically impossible to not comply with Article 5. Because inside of the North Atlantic Treaty, it basically says, following an invocation of Article 5, each member state is going to decide on their own what they think is the appropriate response. So if you have an attack on Romania in the manner that I just described, it's fully possible for Spain to say, you know what, there was an attack there, we don't think it's that big of a deal, and it's not worth getting involved in a larger scale war as a consequence of that. So the way that we are going to respond is by maybe paying for the funerals of those who were involved in the attack. I know that there is a public perception of Article 5 triggering some sort of massive retaliation, and of course that is possible, but it is not what is written there. And in fact, what Article 5 really tells us is it's the start of some sort of longer process in terms of how to decide what to do in response to the attack. What's your favorite video game? Good question to close things out. Let me give you the top 5 list. Number 5, Perfect Dark HD. I still think it is the best first-person shooter ever created. Number 4, Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. Best combat system that the Legend of Zelda series has ever had. And I think it's interesting that a spin-off of the Legend of Zelda series actually has the best Legend of Zelda plotline in it. Number 3, get your exclamation points ready because it is Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain. Number 2, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. And I know I'm going to get flack for this, but I think that Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom was actually even better than the original. That's it for today. If you missed my big video on Sunday about how NATO is constructed, I actually talked to Secretary General Mark Rutte, so you should check that out. And I'll see you next time. Take care.